just around the corner.
Okay, it's no win. We'll do it just for one time.
But the fair weather didn't last. As the seas grew higher, the next port seemed a long way away. And where was the stevedore when the stow collapsed? The UK club finds that 50% of cargo damage incidents are a result of human error. Where did things go wrong in this case? There were failures of hardware and maintenance management. Error-enforcing conditions were present, and incompatible goals. There's no doubt it was a bad day for the chief officer. But what were the latent failures that made this an accident waiting to happen? Unless the right tools and equipment are available and in working order, you're inviting a failure in the category hardware. Maintenance that's delayed, missed, or poorly planned is guilty in many incidents where human error gets the blame. What makes an experienced, responsible chief officer load more cargo than he can properly stow? The answer is the error-enforcing condition that's an everyday experience: commercial pressure. He was so used to it, it simply didn't occur to him to refuse the additional cargo. That day, the chief officer learned 2 lessons the hard way. Commerce should never override good seamanship. And what suits people ashore won't always suit the ship. Far too often, human error leads to injury and death. A new able seaman on a ro-ro had little experience and less training. He'd paid cash for his counterfeit certificate. The boatswain already had misgivings. When a ballast tank had to be prepared for survey, he warned the newcomer to study the tank entry procedure and follow it to the letter. Unfortunately, all the procedures were in English, which the able seaman couldn't read. To save face, he improvised. Not expecting to be in the tank long, he posted a man at the entrance to keep an eye on him. It was a risk that didn't pay off. In less than a minute, the able seaman collapsed.
Adam? Adam!
Rather than follow him into a potentially toxic environment, the other man sensibly alerted the boatswain. Hearing that the breathing gear hadn't been used, the boatswain ordered him to fetch it. But that wasn't so easy. Access to the locker was blocked. Instead of waiting, the boatswain went in, trying not to breathe. By the time the rescuers arrived, there were only bodies to bring out. The UK club finds that 60% of personal injuries are a result of human error, mainly the crew injuring themselves. Where did things go wrong in this case? There were failures in procedures, housekeeping, training, and defences. There's no such thing as a person who is accident-prone. Human error affects us all, without fear or favour. The able seaman was a newcomer. Lack of training and experience made him ignorant of the correct procedure. Not so the boatswain. But experience can be your enemy if it makes you complacent about risks you're familiar with. Two very different men took the same action and paid the same awful penalty. If the latent failures had been spotted, it would never have happened. Good procedures are central to preventing incidents. The ISM code now requires all ships to have written procedures for every operation affecting safety. These must be available to the crew and in a language they understand. The boatswain did well to point the able seaman toward the right procedure, but didn't confirm that he'd understood it, as the code requires. So much is made of safety management systems, it's tempting to see them as a substitute for thought. They're not. Constant vigilance is still required, especially when there are newcomers aboard. Equipment and systems that detect hazards, contain them, or protect us from them are called defences. Undermining these defences leads to loss, injury, and death. Yet the UK club's inspectors routinely find fire doors lashed back, life rafts hard to deploy, fire hoses, and lifebuoys missing. In this case, the breathing equipment was present and in working order, but not accessible when needed. Such failures in housekeeping can have costly and tragic results. If good procedures are central to preventing incidents, so are good seafarers. If the able seaman had known the ropes, the fatalities wouldn't have occurred. STCW 95 insists all crew are qualified, but that should be taken with a pinch of salt. No certificate is a guarantee of competence, still less experience. When you're manning sophisticated ships with smaller crews, cheap can be dear. Knowing that, prudent ship owners recruit the best manpower they can afford and make certain they're fit by using health screening schemes like the UK Club's Crew Risk Management Programme.
Okay. Deep breathe. Deep breathe. Acolo să fie un control.
Trebuie să închidem magazinele. Vecinii anunțăm pe dumneavoastră.
Careful officers confirm their staff's ability and develop their potential. People can be a vital asset or a liability. The choice is yours.
E bine așa, da. Are dreptate.
Sometimes it's the way ships are designed that turns a simple human error into a catastrophe.
Boy, we know we're gonna run out. I said one
A chemical tanker was discharging when the chief officer was called by the terminal.
Command 63.
Yes, this is ship.
Stand by here, we trying to spot it right now.
They wanted to top off some shore tanks. So he did as they asked and reduced pumping pressure. He called the terminal to confirm that he'd done it.
Nothing master, we reduced the speed. Over.
Moments later, he was distracted again.
Look, Chief, we're never going to get number 5 finished before you set, so can you have a look at it?
He left the radio behind. Then, the engineer left the room, knocking a pump control lever fully on.
Command 63.
The terminal tried to alert the ship. In vain. Normally, a seaman monitored the pressure gauges at the manifold. But he'd been called away to help set up a backup pump because one of the cargo pumps had failed.
Boy, we know we're gonna run out. I said one more.
The chief officer returned too late to stop a shoreline failing. The cleanup cost $250,000. Pollution incidents are infrequent, but costly. Where did things go wrong in this case? There were failures in design, communication, organization, and defenses. The active failure was the accidental increase in pumping pressure. But the incident would never have occurred if the console had been designed to prevent the controls being moved unintentionally. Leaving the radio in an empty control room led to a basic failure of communication. There was a built-in defense, the man monitoring the pressure gauges at the manifold. But crew numbers that are just enough when all goes to plan can't always cope with the unexpected. In fact, the master had previously reported the faulty pump to the ship's managers. They decided to postpone repairs until the next dry docking. They didn't realize how serious the consequences could be. In our final case, the pilot was late.
Third job today already, so...
When he arrived, it was the first surprise the master would have that night.
Case, Bucker.
Case.
Leslie, long time no see. When was that?
Manila.
Manila, yeah.
It's all right, second mate. We don't need that. It's Case Backer, his old shipmate.
The tide was ebbing fast, so they lost no time getting underway.
Bridge forward, bridge aft, pilots on board, single up 1 and 1 each end.
Soon they were following a zigzag track between the islands of the Delta. The second officer did her best to keep an eye on their progress, even though it seemed to amuse the old salts.
After sort of...
Then a light she'd been expecting to see didn't show up.
-3 golf balls. It's all in.
No.
One that could not be easily missed on a clear night like that. Or could it? She supposed it was out of order. The pilot would know that, of course. But the doubt wouldn't go away. And the second officer plotted another GPS position. It showed they'd missed a wheelover point and were moments away from running aground. The ship was hardly scratched, but damage to the coral reef cost $500,000. The increase in incidents attributed to pilot error is a matter of concern. But pilots don't work on their own. Where did things go wrong in this case? There were error-enforcing conditions and failures in communication and organization. Commercial pressures act on pilots as well as ship staff. Time was on nobody's side. Was it that, or other factors that made two experienced mariners negligent? In an ideal world, masters would brief pilots about the handling characteristics of their ships, and pilots would detail their plans before the handover takes place. In the real world, the pilot conference often amounts to little more than a handshake. But commercial pressures don't do away with the need to exchange this information. It makes open communication between pilots, masters, and officers even more vital. Does it really happen? Canada's Transportation Safety Board thinks not. It asked hundreds of masters and pilots, do you communicate well? Yes, said 80% of both groups. So, do pilots tell masters their plan? 51% of pilots said yes. Only 24% of masters agreed. Do masters explain how their ship handles? 75% said yes, but only 19% of pilots agreed. Question after question confirmed that the perceptions of each group were in conflict. Why? Perhaps the masters assumed the pilots knew all about their ship. Maybe the pilots believed the masters were familiar with the waters. The researchers' conclusion: neither group expected to give much information or receive much in return. On the bridge, a keep-it-to-yourself culture can only lead to calamity. That's because communication is the driving force of teamwork, and teamwork is essential to safe navigation. No one can play a full part in the bridge team until the master champions open communication. Each member must feel free to challenge the assumptions, actions, or inaction of another whenever there's a concern about safety. The second officer wasn't alone in failing to speak up. 51% of masters claimed that they, their officers, and the pilot always work as a team. Yet 77% of their officers said they were reluctant to question pilots' decisions. Instead of second-guessing the pilot, the second officer should have made sure she knew his intentions. The master should have insisted on the ship's passage plan being berth to berth, not pilot station to pilot station. If the pilot had briefed the bridge team properly, they could have monitored progress step by step and supported his decision-making. That would also maintain their situational awareness, so they could tackle an emergency with no time wasted getting their bearings. The sea is a high-risk environment. So is the market ships trade in. Fierce competition means low freight rates, and that often means lean crews.